And to the analysis of Shields and Brooks, syndicated columnist Mark Shields, New York Times columnist David Brooks. Mark, what is there to say about today's jobs report?
Jim, there's one number that I think is important in understanding this. They ask the question pollsters do every month: do you think the country's headed in the right direction or seriously off on the wrong track? Right now, by a margin of 5-1, Americans think the country's off on the wrong track.
And that's both liberals and conservatives?
Liberals and conservatives across the board.
Republicans?
Democrats,
okay.
Yeah, old, young.
Yep.
And you have to go all the way back to January of 2004 before you found a plurality of Americans thinking the country was headed in the right direction. It's 47-45. And then unemployment was at 5.7. 94 consecutive months. The psychological condition of the country has been pessimism. And that's just so. These numbers aren't going to change it. These numbers aren't going to change it. I mean, these numbers are better than they are worse. They're more slightly encouraging than they are discouraging, but they aren't going to change the direction of that psychological environment, emotional environment in which the country finds itself.
You see it in those same terms?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think we were in it for just a long period. I mean, there were some little good signs. Catherine Rampell talked about the temporary workers. Right, yeah. Productivity was way up. Mm-hmm. Productivity's way up. They tend to hire later, but it's just going to be a long haul. And then there's been a lot of talk recently about the structural problems underneath the cyclical problems. Yeah. And so, for example, there's some theory going around that, we went through a period decades ago where we really got rid of a lot of industrial workers. Now we could be going through a period where we're getting a lot of little mid-level white-collar workers as computers take over some of those managerial-type jobs. I'm sort of haunted by a conversation I had about 2 weeks ago with a business leader, and I was lamenting the terrible shape of the economy. And he said, we've managed to survive in it. We now know how to work in an economy that's growing 1% a year. We get great productivity. We're able to build our profits. We've learned to adapt to this. And that means, no hunger to hire more. And that'll come, but it's just a long time.
Some of the comments that were made in Jeff's discussion were words like never in terms of getting a lot of these jobs back. Some of these jobs will never come back, and that's what you're saying. People know that. They have figured that out.
They do know that, and then Ingrid Schroeder from Pew's statistic that almost 1 out of 3 has been unemployed for over a year.
That's an extraordinary
statistic. It really is, because that has a depressant on the person. I mean, when you've been out of work that long, it's tougher to get up and have your dauber up and be looking again. You become defensive, you become pessimistic, and employers do. David's right about productivity's up, but as a consequence, because it's very much of a hiring market, pay is down. And benefits are down, so they're getting talented workers for less than they did before.
Sure. Now, what are the politics of this now, David? We had in the news summary, Hari. Well, what the president said. Hey, there's some signs. But it's up to the Congress. In other words, it's up to the Republicans to do something about it. The Republican leadership, Speaker Boehner, says no. It's up to the Democratic Senate. And it just has a kind of a sameness to it, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, right now it's Charlie Cook's, I think, proposition that there could be a rebellion against both parties is possible if this continues time and time again. I guess I'm struck by the fact that Obama's hanging in there reasonably well. Mm-hmm. If you look at the head-to-head polls, how he's doing against a generic Republican, slightly behind, how he's doing against Mitt Romney, pretty much okay, tied. Personal approval ratings about 43. Considering the condition Mark talked about, the months and months of negative, the country's in wrong, the country's in decline, he's actually doing okay. And so there's an aura of disappointment around him. But I'd say in general it's just a disgust with everybody, but not so much him personally.
You agree that he's not getting it as hot as a lot of people would have expected with these kinds of numbers?
Well, I think if I told you that by a 5-1 margin, people thought the country was headed in the wrong direction, that 9.1% unemployment, the economy growing at whatever 1.5%, you'd say, where's the president? You'd say in the low 30s. So I think he has defied gravity so far, and I think that's because there is still a residual reservoir of good feeling, people rooting for him to succeed. But there is still a sense of pervasive sense of disappointment about his presidency, in part because hopes were so high and so many people invested that hope in him.
Mark has just created a wonderful segue, which I'm now going to use. Speaking of defying gravity,
Yeah, I see where you're headed.
where does the Herman Cain situation stand tonight in your eyes, my friend?
Yeah, I guess I think it's a bubble.
A bubble.
A bubble. I don't think that he will continue to defy gravity. I've never thought that. I thought, there's frames of mind. We've talked about this in the past.
Sure.
In the preseason, yeah, fun. Herman Cain, fun. But then when you get to choose a president, you choose a president. And he certainly justified the belief that he's not ready to be president. This is a job that requires discipline and organization and professionalism. And we can all talk, it's lovely to have outsiders who are political amateurs. But if you're actually in the White House or seriously running for it, you need to have these essentially boring qualities. And he doesn't have them. And if he certainly showed that this week, his response, forget the harassment charges, his response to just the charges, which he was warned about 10 days before they made public. The fact that he couldn't...
Who warned him?
Politico magazine. First broke
the Politico
story.
magazine told him 10 days before.
They were investigating, and he knew they were investigating,
Yeah.
so he knew it was coming out.
Okay.
The fact that they didn't do kindergarten-level preparation for this story is just incredibly damning. And so he's charming. People are going to like him, but you got to practice politics at the kindergarten level.
At some level, Herman Cain's candidacy is a reflection, if not a direct product, of the feverish anti-government fervor of Republicans, because they really have so little regard, Republican primary voters, for government.
For the pros.
That's right, and for government, that it's a
The very
serious
people
business. Dave was talking about. I mean, that a public policy credential or a public record or a serious interest in them or involvement is, if anything, a disqualification. That they found almost appealing, if not irresistible, the fact that this is a man who sat with Judy Woodruff on this very set this week and said, China, we found out, is seeking nuclear weapons. China's had nuclear weapons since 1964. But we saw this week in Herman Cain both the limits of his strength and the exposing of his weakness. His strength has always been he's a straight talker. I mean, whatever you say about Herman, let Herman be Herman. And obviously he kept changing his story, embroidering, coming back with different events, remembering things and so forth. He violated the first rule of all political scandals, which is get it all out immediately. Answer all the questions, get it behind you. Instead of being a 1-day or a 2-day story, it's now a 5-day story. It's going in the second weekend. And his weakness is that he's never had a campaign. He's never had a structure, so he didn't have people who could sit down and woodshed him.
But what about the point that people say, and you all have said it, he's not a normal candidate for president, and people like that.
Yeah.
And so he's being judged by a whole different set of standards than the traditional candidates, the very people you were talking about earlier.
Well, if we're in a new world and the normal laws of political gravity don't apply because people are so disgusted with politics, they're willing to break all the normal patterns, well, then he'll be fine. I don't believe we're in that mode. I think people are really disgusted with politics, and they sort of like the idea of an outsider. But I think at the end of the day, they're going to look at the presidency as a profession, as somebody who has to do a job. And so I think they're going to revert to more politics as usual. Mark made the point that it's a hostility toward government. I think it's in part just a hostility toward outside. It's an outsider move. More, not just Republicans, but Democrats too. One of the things that struck me, the Tea Party movement and the Occupy Wall Street movement have one thing in common, more than one, but one thing in common: no leaders. Neither believe in authority structures. And there seems to be this hostility to building structures with leaders and organizations, and therefore liking the freelancer out there, like Herman Cain, who is a freelancer. But if you don't have a structure, a leadership, you're really in a very fragile situation. And one of the things that struck me about the Cain response was that he seems to have, if not misled his own staff, not been forthcoming with his own staff. So they couldn't provide him with the good advice because he wasn't being straight with them. And so I'm a big believer in parties, authority, structure, leadership. It's very old-fashioned, but it happens to work for a reason.
What about the charges themselves, Mark? I mean, the sexual harassment.
Well, now it's three. I mean,
Yeah.
three different women, and two significant settlements for the time. I mean, a year's salary. So it starts to take on a plausibility, if not a credibility. Jim,
But that goes back, though, the idea that that is a traditional hit on a traditional candidate, and the suggestion is that the reason he's still up there in the polls, despite these allegations of sexual harassment, is because he's immune from it because he's not a normal candidate. Does he buy into that at all?
I think if the first reaction was that there is a visceral anti-media impulse in the Republican Party, in Republican voters. So I think he had that going. Oh, it's the press going after him. Unfortunately, his own candidate, he himself, has switched his story from it was the press to it was a left-wing conspiracy to it was Rick Perry, to it was some sort of a high-tech lynching, I think was it. He just, I mean, he's Jim, in an ordinary campaign, which you start with, if Jim Lehrer is going to run for governor, David and I are working with you, we sit down and say, okay, what do we have to know? I mean, what is it?
What's the worst?
Was there a bankruptcy? Was there, what was there? Why did you leave that school? Was that discharge honorable and all the rest of it? And this was obviously never done. And David put his finger on it. They had 10 days notice. He could have gone over to the National Restaurant Association, sat down with the staff, sat down with the lawyers, gone over everything, so he had an answer. And I just don't, I think that we've seen his high watermark. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
One quick final thing is that the American public, as they showed with Bill Clinton, is not as upset with scandal as we are. And I personally think that's kind of a good thing.
Meaning
we pay a lot of attention to these scandals, we in the
press,
media, I guess.
The media, yeah.
But people will say, well, a lot of people have scandals. And I think one of the reasons his poll numbers have stayed high, hostility to the media is part of it, but partly people understand there are scandals in people's lives, and as we've seen with Clinton and we've seen with others, it is possible to survive them because people are willing to be tolerant, whether properly or not.
You agree with that?
Clinton was president. Clinton was president, and he was shrewd enough to lie at the outset and to say, I did not have sexual relations with that woman. And then the idea of 6 months of Bill Clinton later, and his foes emerged and showed themselves to be in an overkill mode, and Clinton started to look reasonable. And I think he would not have survived as a candidate if this had come out.
And if he had said right at the beginning, yes, I did do it.
Yes, I did it right. Yeah, I mean, I think he had to, for his own survival.
I would just say Jennifer Flowers was right in the heat of the New Hampshire primary. And I just think people have more of a tolerance, and I think properly, a lot of great leaders would be knocked off if we had the scandal standards we have today. So a lot of people are willing to say he's got these strengths, he's got these weaknesses.
And we have to go. Thank you both.